Okay, and we're back with chapter 4. So welcome. I'm Felina Carter. I am working on getting my undergraduate degree in neuroscience at Arizona State, and one of the textbooks that I'm using is the Open Neuroscience Initiative. It was put together by Austin Lim and a team of really awesome people that made a project in hopes that this part of education could be free for people pursuing it. It's a really beautiful project. I'll leave a link to the textbook in the description here. And if you look through the introduction of this book, you'll even find a place where you can donate to this cause. So there's a Bitcoin address if you use crypto to send over a few bucks to the folks that were nice enough to put this together for people like me that can't necessarily afford the expensive textbooks. Now, I already did chapter 3, so if you joined me for chapter 3, you'll kind of know how this goes. I am not editing this as a professional audiobook. I don't have the time. This is not something that I can monetize on my end because it's just an open source book that I didn't have anything to do with. So I'm just going to let it kind of free flow. That means while I'm reading, there will be instances where I'm not sure how to pronounce a word, and I will have to stop what I'm doing and go look it up. You'll hear pauses, you'll hear ums. It's not going to be professionally edited, and so for that, I apologize. I recognize that can be kind of distracting, but I'll do my best to make it kind of a fluid reading to get through it. Yep. And hopefully some of the distractions you can laugh along with along the way. I'm from Oklahoma, so my vernacular's a little weird, But enough. We're going to go ahead and dive into chapter 4 today. Let me know if this is something that's helpful to you, because I'll keep making more of them. If it's not helpful, I'm just going to make them for myself instead of posting them. Here we go. Chapter 4. Electrical Properties of Neurons. Again, this was put together by Austin Lim, a PhD of DePaul University. The editor for this chapter is Dina Simmons, a PhD of the University of Chicago. One of the interesting properties of neurons is that their cell membranes are electroactive, meaning that they are sensitive to electrical charge. Neurons are capable of changing the electrical potential of their membranes, which makes them a very dynamic population of cells. These changes, which can happen on a scale of milliseconds, provide a rapid method for one part of a neuron to send signals over long distances, hence the analogy of electrical wires running overhead. In this chapter, we will go into depth describing the molecular and cellular components that contribute to the electrical properties of a neuron, both at rest and during an action potential. Chapter 4 Outline. 4.1 Ion Channels. 4.2 The Electrochemical Gradient. 4.3 The Nernst Equation. 4.4 The Action Potential. 4.5 Movement of action potentials. Now, if you're in my neuroscience class and you're following along, I believe that we only need to do 4.1 through 4.3, but I'm going to be reading all of them because, first of all, it's interesting to me, and second, I'm just kind of posting this out in the world for whoever's listening. 4.1 Ion Channels. The cell membrane that separates the inside of the cell from the outside is a very effective boundary. It is described as being selectively permeable, which means that some molecules are able to travel across the membrane easily, and others have an intermediate ability to cross. And other molecules are completely incapable of passing. Generally, gases and molecules of water are able to pass through the cell membrane easily. Large molecules like glucose and charged molecules like ions or amino acids are unable to pass across the membrane. Most cells of the body, including neurons, have specialized transmembrane proteins embedded in the cell membrane. These transmembrane proteins are huge protein complexes that span the entirety of the membrane, with an outer side and an inner side. In the middle of the protein is a pore, which is essentially a tunnel that allows molecules and ions to pass across the cell membrane. These proteins are called ion channels. These channels are passive since they do not use any cellular energy to move ions. Rather, they simply provide an easy passage for ions. It may be useful to think of an ion channel as a cellular door. One important feature of ion channels is their ability to distinguish ions based on their chemical properties. For example, some channels are selective for Na, which I think is sodium, but I'm not quite sure, while preventing the passage of all other ions. Each ion channel has special molecular characteristics that allow certain types of ions to pass through the pore while excluding other ions. Some features that allow for a distinction between ions include, number 1, pore size. The molecular shape of an ion channel can exclude larger diameter ions if it is small enough, restricting the ability for large ions to enter the pore. In the same way that a ping pong ball cannot pass through a narrow diameter of a straw. Number 2, electrical charge. Ion channels can also prevent certain ions from passing through based on the electrical charge. The inside of the pore is lined with charged amino acids, and their charge allows only certain types of ions to pass. For example, sodium channels have several negatively charged glutamate residues inside the pore. Because of this, negatively charged ions like chloride will be repelled by the negative charges, but the positively charged sodium ions will be attracted to the inside. Going back up, figure 4.1 says Figure 4.1 says selective permeability of molecules across the cell membrane, and it's a graphic kind of explaining how different things can pass through a cell membrane. Figure 4.2 says ion channels, in purple, are transmembrane proteins that can be open, allowing charged ions to cross the cell membrane through a molecular tunnel called the pore. Now down under where I was reading previously is figure 4.3. It says ions dissolved in water are surrounded by a shell of water molecules. The potassium ion is larger, and the water molecules are farther apart, making the attraction weaker than the sodium ion. And it is an image of that. Number 3, hydration shell. Selectivity based on charge and small size is a simple task, but how can it be possible for an ion channel to allow larger ions to pass while excluding smaller ions? This is possible because it is energetically favorable to allow an ion that has been stabilized sufficiently by the properties of the amino acid residues lining the pore. This process is related to the observation that a shell of water molecules surrounds each charged ion in solution. To pass through the pore, water molecules must be separated from the ion. The potassium ion has diffuse... I feel like some of these are maybe not quite English. They're somewhat English. The process is related to the observation that a shell of water molecules surrounds each charged ion in solution. To pass through the pore, water molecules must be separated from the ion. The potassium ion has diffuse hydration shell, and so it is easier to separate water from a potassium ion compared to a sodium ion. The passage of potassium becomes more energetically favorable compared to passing a sodium ion, causing these pores to be selective. Like doors, different types of ion channels open and close under different conditions. We can categorize ion channels into 4 major classes based on their opening and closing conditions. Number 1, leak channels. Leak channels are persistently open. You can think of these leak channels as revolving doors that are never locked. Neurons usually have several leak channels, such as a leak channel for potassium, K, and a leak channel for chloride, Cl, ions. These 2 ions are at equilibrium, flowing back and forth across the cell membrane, and they help contribute to the properties of the neuron at rest. Number 2, voltage-gated ion channels are sensitive to the electrical potential of the surrounding membrane. Their ability to open and close depends on the electrical charge of the membrane. Many of them, such as voltage-gated sodium, or Na+, channels remain closed at negative potentials, or the resting condition, and only open at positive potentials, action potential. Number 3, ligand-gated ion channels. Open in response to binding certain molecules, ligands, such as neurotransmitters. These types of ion channels are also called ionotropic receptors. Let's look it up.
Ionotropic.
Why is that so loud? Number 3, ligand-gated ion channels. Open in response to binding certain molecules, ligands, such as neurotransmitters. These types of ion channels are also called ionotropic receptors, and these will be described in much more depth in Chapter 5. Number 4, the fourth class of ion channels is a catch-all category that includes a wide variety of channels that are used by sensory systems. They open and close in response to unique stimuli, depending on what they are able to sense. For example, some open and close depending on where they are moved physically, such as a distortion or stretch. We have these in our ears, hair cells, which we'll learn in Chapter 8.1, in our skin, Pacinian corpuscle, something that I can't quite pronounce, but we will learn about it in Chapter 8.3, so I won't spend too much time. So I'm going to back it up a little bit. We have, so I'm going to back it up. The fourth class of ion channels, catch-all category, includes a wide variety of channels that are used by the sensory systems. They open and close in response to unique stimuli, depending on what they are able to sense. For example, some open and close when they are moved physically, such as in distortion or stretch. We have these in our ears, which are the hair cells, in our skin, and in our muscles, which is Golgi, I can't remember how to pronounce it, Golgi, tendon, organ, which we'll learn in Chapter 10. Photoreceptors in our eyes have ion channels that close in response to being hit by photons of light, and this activity is necessary for us to be able to see in both brightly and dimly lit environments. 4.2, the electrochemical gradient. Without ion channels, ions do not cross the cell membrane and therefore stay either outside or inside the cell. But when an ion channel is present and open, ions can move across the cell membrane depending on the specific conditions inside and outside the neuron. There are two different forces that act on ions once an ion channel is open: the electrical gradient and the chemical gradient. Number 1, electrical gradient. The electrical gradient refers to the electrical forces acting on charged molecules, pulling opposite charges together while also pushing like charges away from one another, just like the polarity of magnets. At rest, the interior of a cell has a negative charge, about negative 70 millivolts. Because of these negative charges inside the cell, the electrical gradient causes positively charged ions to be attracted to the inside of the cell. At the same time, negatively charged ions will be repelled out of the cell. The voltage of the neuron, pictured as uppercase V with a little m, can deviate significantly from negative 70 millivolts, reaching potentials as high as 40 millivolts. When the Vm changes, the force exerted by the electrical gradient changes as well. If the cell now has a positive potential instead of a negative potential, movement of charged ions will change as well. In this case, the electrical gradient now attracts negatively charged ions into the cell while pushing positively charged ions out of the cell. That was electrical gradient. Number 2, chemical gradient. The chemical gradient refers to the natural process by which a high concentration of a substance, given enough time, will eventually diffuse to a lower concentration and settle evenly over the space. Figure 4.5 says the chemical gradient describes the same forces acting on ions as diffusion, where ions move from areas of high concentration to low concentration. You can think of the chemical gradient as similar to the way people behave when they exit a full elevator. People don't want to be so close to each other inside of a cramped space. Once the doors open, people scatter quickly, going to where they can have more personal space. They move from an area of high concentration to low concentration. Molecules behave the same way. Unlike the electrical gradient, the chemical gradient is unaffected by biological movement of ions. In other words, the distribution of ions across the membrane does not change significantly. The number of ions that flow across the membrane is so minute that the relative distribution of ions across the cell membrane essentially does not change. These two forces are collectively called electrochemical gradient. In order to accurately predict the forces acting on a given ion, you need to know 1. The charge of the ion, and 2. The relative concentrations of ions across the membrane. Take a look at the following two examples. Number 1, sodium, or Na. I knew it was Na. Sodium, or Na, movement across the membrane. Consider the positively charged ion sodium. Because it has a positive charge, it is electrically attracted to the inside of the cell, which has a negative charge at rest. Therefore, when a sodium permeable ion channel opens, and sodium is now able to pass across the cell membrane, the electrical gradient causes the sodium to move into the cell. We also know that the concentration of sodium outside of the cell, written as Na+, where the brackets indicate concentration and the O refers to outside, is high compared to the concentration of sodium inside of the cell, written as Na+, by roughly an order of magnitude. By the way, this is in reference to an image that's in the book that I'll explain in a second. Therefore, when that sodium permeable ion channel opens, sodium will move from the area of high concentration to low concentration, causing Na sodium to move into the cell. Given that both the electrical and chemical gradients are in favor of moving sodium into the cell, opening a sodium channel causes a net flow of sodium ions into the cell. So all of that was in reference to figure 4.6 that says when a sodium channel opens, pictured in purple, sodium ions, pictured in orange, are acted on by two forces. They have a positive charge, which is attracted to the negatively charged inside of the cell, electrical gradient. They are at a higher concentration outside of the cell, which causes them to move to the inside of the cell with the lower concentration, chemical gradient. So both examples. So that was one of the examples. The next example, number 2, potassium, K, movement across the membrane. Just like with sodium, we can use our knowledge of potassium's charge and the distribution of potassium ions across the membrane in order to predict the forces acting on K, potassium ions, when a potassium channel is open. We know that the inside of the cell is negative, and potassium has a positive charge, so the electrical gradient causes potassium to be attracted into the cell. We also know that the inside of the cell has a relatively high concentration of K, potassium ions, compared to the outside of the cell. Therefore, the chemical gradient pushes potassium out of the cell. Since the ion concentrations across the membrane don't change significantly, but the membrane voltage can, you can imagine there exists some Vm where the flow of ions moving in are exactly equal to the flow of ions moving out. In this case, the two forces acting on the ion oppose one another perfectly, resulting in a dynamic equilibrium. This process is called dynamic because there is a constant movement of ions going in and out, and yet there is an equilibrium because there is no net movement of charge. The charge moving in is balanced by the charge moving out. Since the ion concentrations across the membrane do not change significantly, but the membrane voltage can, you could imagine there exists some Vm where the flow of ions moving in are exactly equal to the flow of ions moving out. In this case, the two forces acting on the ion oppose one another perfectly, resulting in a dynamic equilibrium. This process is called dynamic because there is a constant movement of ions going in and going out, and yet there is an equilibrium because there is no net movement of charge. The charge moving in is balanced by the charge moving out. This exact value of the Vm is called the equilibrium potential for the ion, which is also abbreviated E of x. So it's a big E with a little x, where x is the ion of interest. The equilibrium potential differs for each ion and is described in table 4.1. 4.1, just a reminder, was the table that I mentioned, shows all of the different ways that things can move through a cell membrane. On this page, figure 4.7 says, when a potassium channel opens, pictured in blue, potassium ions, pictured in green, are acted on by two opposing forces. They have a positive charge, which is attracted to the negatively charged inside of the cell through an electrical gradient. At the same time, they are at higher concentration inside of the cell, which causes them to want to move outside of the cell, a chemical gradient. This process is at equilibrium, and it's an image of that. Table 4.8 says charged ions are unequally distributed across the cell membrane. Typical concentrations of ions in a mammalian neuron. And it's a table that has sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium, magnesium, and miscellaneous anions. Got it. It shows the abbreviation, the concentration outside of the cell, which is showing by X, and the concentration inside. So it's a table of all of those things. Section 4.3. Now, before we get into the next section, I know that it's going to be directly in relation to this EX situation. So just to reiterate, EX is an abbreviation of the equilibrium potential for the ion, and the X is the ion of interest. So it's equilibrium potential of this ion. Okay, so I just wanted to revisit that from mostly my sake, because now we're on 4.3, calculating E of X and the Nernst equation. Even though the equilibrium potential, EX, for each ion can be determined experimentally, it is also possible to calculate E of X using a mathematical equation called the Nernst equation. By understanding the Nernst equation, you can predict the direction that ions will move when an ion channel opens given various conditions. The Nernst equation is as follows. I'm just going to write it right here so you can see it. E of X is the equilibrium potential. As a potential, it has units in volts, usually measured in millivolts. When a cell's membrane potential is exactly at this EX, the ion is at equilibrium. That means the ion movement into the cell is matched by the ion movement out of the cell. E of X is sometimes also called the reversal potential, because once the cell membrane crosses from the potential, the net movement of the ions reverses directions. This value is also called the Nernst potential, in honor of Walther Nernst, the Nobel Prize-winning German chemist who first developed the formula to describe electrochemical reactions. R, which it looks like we're talking about in reference to this equation, R is the ideal gas constant. It has a value of 8.314 J-K, moles. The R term is included in the equation because it is a way to convert between the number of molecules and the energy that those molecules exert. T is the temperature in Kelvin. To convert from Celsius into Kelvin, add 273 to the Celsius value. So Celsius plus 273 equals Kelvin. Usually room temperature is around 293 Kelvin, and biological temperatures are closer to 310 Kelvin. This term is included in the equation since all biological processes are temperature dependent, especially those at the level of molecular machinery. Z from the equation is the electrical charge of the ion. For sodium and potassium, Z is +1. For chloride or monovalent anions, Z is -1. And for divalent, oh man, gotta look this one up. Divalent. Okay, so let's try Z again. Z is the electrical charge of the ion. For sodium and potassium, Z is +1. For chloride or monovalent anions, Z is -1. And for divalent cations like calcium and magnesium, Z is +2. This term is essential since the Nernst potential is used to predict the direction of ion movement based on the charge of the ion. This value represents the influence exerted by the electrical gradient. F is the Faraday constant, which has a value of 96,485 coulombs. Coulombs. Doesn't look like that. Okay, F is the Faraday constant, which has a value of 96,485 coulombs per mole. XO and XI, I'm saying that like that because I is down to the side, O is down to the side. These represent the concentration of ion X outside of the cell and inside of the cell respectively. Their units are generally in mm. It's a lowercase m and an uppercase m, but I'm not sure if that is, I'm not sure which one that is. So lowercase m, uppercase m. Their units are generally in this, but these units cancel out in the equation. These values represent the forces acting on the ions by the chemical gradient. The Nernst equation has many complex constants and terms, so neuroscientists often use the back of the envelope equation as a shortcut for quickly calculating the equilibrium potential. This shortcut equation condenses down the R and F constants, turns the natural log into a base 10 logarithm. I'm not quite sure what that is, so we're going to look it up. Logarithm. A quantity representing the power to which a fixed number, the base, must be raised to produce a given number. What does it mean when it's a base 10? A logarithm to base 10, also known as the common logarithm, is a way of expressing how many times a number must be multiplied by itself to get a certain result. I still don't understand, but I feel like perhaps we will revisit it later. Okay. Anyway, the back of the envelope equation condenses down the R and F constants and turns the natural log into a base 10 logarithm and assumes the calculations are done at a physiological temperature. The shortcut formula can be written as, I'll put it right here. Equation 4.10, it's just in regards to that equation. The back of the envelope equation is a shortcut to estimate the reversal potential for an ion X. Here they are side by side. They don't do that in the book, but I think it's important. The Nernst equation is able to calculate the reversal potential for individual ions, assuming that the appropriate ion channels are open. However, in neurons, not all ion channels are opened or closed at the same time. In a neuron at rest, usually sodium does not enter the cells since sodium channels are closed. K, or potassium ions, on the other hand, are often moving through leak channels all the time. Chloride channels are generally open as well, but they pass less current at rest than potassium channels do. A formula called the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation, GHK equation, combines the Nernst potential of three relevant ions, sodium, potassium, and chloride, into a single equation that, when evaluated, gives us the value of the membrane potential, or Vm. The GHK equation is written as Equation 4.11, the Goldman-Hodgkin-Katz equation, is used to calculate the membrane potential given permeability of ions and their concentrations across the cell membrane. When you analyze the GHK equation, you will notice that it's essentially a combination of the Nernst equations for the equilibrium potentials for the three ions. The GHK equation also introduces a new term, the value of P, which stands for permeability. Again, the ability for an ion to cross the membrane through the ion channels. Permeability itself does not have a unit. It's easier to think of permeability as the weight of each equilibrium potential. The higher the permeability for a given ion, the closer the Vm is to the Ex. For my sake, I'm breaking that down. Membrane potential is Vm, and Ex is the equilibrium of this ion, equilibrium of X. The higher the permeability for a given ion, the closer the Vm, or membrane potential, is to the Ex, or equilibrium of X, for that ion. For example, consider the value of the GHK equations for neurons at rest. So once again, if you're following along with me for Neuroscience 101, our reading requirements stop at 4.3. I'm now going to go into 4.4, just for some additional information, for the sake of completing this chapter, for the sake of OCD, whatever we're going to call it. But right now we are on 4.4. The action potential. The action potential is a short-lasting, 1 or 2 milliseconds, temporary change in membrane potential that can travel down the length of the axon. Action potentials are the main method of communication that neurons use, and each action potential triggers the release of neurotransmitters at the axon terminal of a chemical synapse. Action potentials are all or nothing responses, meaning that only a large change in potential will be able to pass the signal forward, but small subthreshold changes in VM will not. Subthreshold changes in VM are graded potentials. Just to revisit a vocabulary word for the sake of me, VM stands for membrane potential, which is the voltage difference across a neuron's membrane. It's measured in millivolts. During an action potential, the membrane potential deviates from the resting membrane potential of around negative 70 millivolts. This value can range from negative 90 millivolts to negative 50 millivolts, depending on the type of neuron, to positive potentials. Okay, so what that means, during an action potential, the membrane can deviate from between negative 70 millivolts all the way to negative 90 millivolts, to a positive potential. When VM goes from negative to a more positive potential, this change is described as depolarization. Likewise, when VM changes to a value that is more negative, it is called hyperpolarization. The action potential has a very characteristic shape: a rapid depolarization followed by a prolonged hyperpolarization before repolarizing and slowly returning to the resting membrane potential over the next few milliseconds. Cells regularly receive many inputs at once. To trigger an action potential, the sum of the inputs must be sufficiently depolarizing to bring the VM to a value that is more positive than the action potential threshold. For an average neuron, the action potential threshold is about negative 55 millivolts. Anything less than the action potential threshold will fail to send the signal forward. The change in membrane potential seen in action potential is driven by the movement of ions, predominantly sodium and potassium, across the cell membrane through voltage-gated ion channels. An action potential takes place in 5 steps, some of which overlap in duration. Figure 4.12 says when the neuronal membrane potential becomes more positive above the resting membrane potential, we call it depolarization. When the membrane potential becomes more negative, we say it's hyperpolarized. And it's an image of that, what it looks like, depolarization versus hyperpolarization. Figure 4.13 says if the depolarization exceeds the action potential threshold, roughly negative 55 millivolts, the neuron will fire an action potential. And on this image, it's showing in green. It is showing an action potential. This next section looks like it's going to elaborate on the sentence, an action potential takes place in 5 steps, some of which overlap in duration. So revisiting that sentence. Number 1, depolarization from incoming neurons. Presynaptic neurons that release neurotransmitters onto dendrites cause a small amount of ion movement via postsynaptic ligand-gated ion channels. These small deviations in membrane voltage are called postsynaptic potentials, or PSPS, like when you call a cat. Psst, psst. PSPs. Release of excitatory neurotransmitters causes small depolarizations, which are called excitatory postsynaptic potentials, or EPSPs. EPSPs. So far we have PSPs, which is postsynaptic potentials, and EPSPs, which is excitatory postsynaptic potentials. While the release of inhibitory neurotransmitters cause small hyperpolarizations, or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials, IPSPs. These PSPs are characterized by a fast but small rising phase where the VM, membrane potential, changes quickly, followed by a slower decay phase where the VM resets back to resting potential. Usually single EPSPs, which again is excitatory postsynaptic potential, usually a single EPSP only causes a small amount of depolarization that isn't sufficient for bringing the VM above the threshold potential. Reaching the threshold often requires multiple EPSPs. Multiple EPSPs are added together in one of 2 ways: spatial summation, and temporal summation. Spatial summation happens when 2 small EPSPs from 2 adjacent inputs are triggered. Temporal summation occurs when multiple EPSPs from the same input occur close together in time. Each individual EPSP has a normal decay period, and adding a second EPSP during that decay period causes the 2 to add together. which may now be large enough to bring the VM above the action potential threshold, and when a large enough total depolarization of membrane potential reaches the soma, an action potential is initiated at the axon hillock. I'd like to revisit axon hillock because I'm having some trouble with vocabulary. The axon hillock, according to Google, and again, I would recommend double checking this in the prior chapter. The axon hillock is a cone-shaped part of a neuron that controls when an electrical impulse or action potential is generated. Its primary integrative zone of the is the primary integrative zone of the neuron, where it receives and processes signals from other neurons and the environment. So that is the axon hillock. But again, please check it. Make sure that Google isn't hallucinating. Figure 4.14 says, activation of excitatory inputs on the left causes depolarization, while activation of inhibitory inputs on the right can cause hyperpolarization. It's an interesting picture. Figure 4.15. Spatial summation is the addition of signals from two inputs adjacent to each other, which is pictured on the left, while temporal summation is the addition of two signals close together in time on the right. Okay, so that was number one, and the thing that we're listing, just to revisit, it is an action potential takes place in 5 steps, some of which overlap in duration. So the first step was depolarization from incoming neurons. That's what we just went through just now. Number 2 is opening of voltage-gated Na, which is sodium, channels. At rest, the voltage-gated ion channels are almost all closed, but as the VM depolarizes, the channels are more likely to open. At this point, we use our understanding of the electrochemical gradient to predict the movement of sodium ions. The positively charged sodium ions are drawn to the negative potential on the inside of the cell, and the ions move from the area of high concentration outside of the cell to an area of lower concentration inside the cell. Both forces are in favor of sodium entering the cell when the voltage-gated sodium channels open, and this movement of positive charges into the cell causes further depolarization. Sodium movement across the cell membrane into the cell causes the VM to depolarize to very positive potentials. The peak of the action potential can reach positive 40 millivolts. Number 3 in the list of steps that an action potential takes is opening of voltage-gated potassium channels. Okay. Embedded in the cell membranes are other voltage-gated channels that are selective for potassium rather than sodium. Like the voltage-gated sodium channels, these potassium channels begin to open when the cell starts to depolarize, allowing potassium ions to move across the cell membrane. When the cell has depolarized to about positive 40 millivolts, we can use our knowledge of this electrochemical gradient to make predictions about what happens to potassium ions. The positive potential inside the neuron repels potassium using the electrical gradient, and the relatively high concentration of potassium inside of the cell pushes potassium out of the cell, chemical gradient. Looking up in figure 4.16, it says voltage-gated sodium channels have a molecular structure that allows the channel to temporarily change structure in response to the membrane voltage. A small depolarization to negative 50 millivolts causes the channel to open, while a large depolarization of above negative 30 millivolts causes the channels to inactivate, blocking further sodium currents. And this is depicting a closed state, the open state, and the inactivated state. Yeah. And that one was for sodium. Going back down, it says, in total, both of these forces act on the potassium ions to leave the neuron. Movement of positive charges charge carriers out of the cell makes the interior of the cell and VM more negative. Potassium movement through the voltage-gated potassium channels causes the cells to become more negative than the resting membrane potential. Number 4 in the steps of an action potential, inactivation of voltage-gated sodium channels. Voltage-gated sodium channels have a very complex molecular structure. In addition to having a pore through which ions can move across the cell membrane, they have an inactivation gate that can block the flow of sodium ions. When the cell membrane reaches a positive potential, the inactivation gate closes, thus preventing further movement of excitatory depolarizing sodium ions. These voltage-gated sodium channels undergo the inactivation process very rapidly, oftentimes faster than a millisecond. Finally, number 5, deactivation of voltage-gated potassium channels. In this last step of the action potential, the main current flow is an outward current as the positively charged potassium ions are driven out of the cell through voltage-gated potassium channels by the electrochemical gradient. When positive charges leave the cell, the interior once again becomes more negative. Unlike the voltage-gated sodium channels, the process of deactivation is much slower. On average, it may take these channels a few milliseconds to deactivate. When these potassium channels deactivate, the hyperpolarizing current stops, which causes the membrane potential to gradually return to the equilibrium of resting potential. In summary, you can also think of the shape of the action potential as consisting of 3 phases. Number 1, depolarization. The upward deflection, negative 70 millivolts to positive 40 millivolts of the action potential that lasts for half a millisecond. VM becomes more positive because of sodium ions that enter the cell through the voltage sodium channels. At this step, the voltage-gated potassium channels also start to open. Number 2, repolarization, the rapid downward deflection from positive 40 millivolts to negative 70 millivolts, also lasting for about half a millisecond. Here, the voltage-gated sodium channels have almost all inactivated, and positively charged potassium ions are being driven out of the cell through the voltage-gated potassium channels. As positive charges leave the cell, VM becomes more negative. Membrane potential becomes more negative. Number 3, after hyperpolarization, the slow return back to the resting membrane potential. So negative 70 millivolts to negative 80 millivolts and back to negative 70 millivolts. That can last for a few milliseconds. This return back to the equilibrium of the resting state is due to the gradual deactivation of voltage-gated potassium channels. We're going to pause there for a second and go back up. There is a clinical connection here. Going back up to the clinical connection on the previous page. Clinical connection, chronic pain. Well, there's a word I don't know. Nociception. Seriously? You know, advertisements for pronunciation is cruel.
Or looking at how to pronounce these words and more vocabulary from anatomy and medical terms, so make sure to stay tuned. Nociception.
Nociception, that's literally all I needed from you. That was dramatic. Clinical connection, chronic pain. Nociception is a complex sensation that the nervous system detects rapidly. Pain is the perception that the body is experiencing some kind of injury or noxious stimulus. So pain triggers a reflex that causes a person to withdraw from the painful stimulus, which decreases the severity of the damage. Pain can also create memories that discourage people from future contact with pain-inducing situations. When we experience a noxious stimulus, That information is sent toward the central nervous system by means of action potentials, and in most cases, the detection of pain is a healthy, protective sensation. There are, however, some people with a dysregulation in their somatosensory systems that cause them to experience pain even in the absence of injurious stimuli, a condition called allodynia. We're going to look it up. Allodynia. Allodynia. So again, people with a dysregulation in their somatosensory systems that cause them to experience pain, even if they're not being hurt, it's a condition called allodynia. It's a condition called allodynia. Although we still don't understand what causes allodynia, it is known that some changes in voltage-gated sodium channel properties causes an increase of excitability of pain-sensing neurons is increased. Moving back down, we were talking about the list that explains the movement of an action potential. So there were 3 of them total. We were talking about after hyperpolarization, which is where it moves kind of back to the center, and that's where I was. Ions moving across the membrane change the membrane potential. The best way to think about the change in VM, membrane potential, in response to ion movement is to consider the equilibrium potential of each individual ion that is moving. So, for example, Na is positive 55 millivolts. When a voltage-gated sodium channel opens and sodium ions are able to move across the cell membrane, the membrane potential shifts toward ENA, which is a depolarization. During repolarization phase, when the voltage-gated potassium channels open, the potential across the cell membrane now shifts towards the equilibrium potential for potassium, which is close to negative 80 millivolts. The steps of the action potential can also be thought of in mathematical terms by examining the variables of the GHK equation. As permeability for a given ion increases, it shifts the balance of VM more heavily toward the equilibrium potential of that specific ion. So during the depolarization phase of the action potential, when the voltage-gated sodium channels open, the permeability term for sodium, represented as Pna, increases to as high as 20, which causes the VM to move towards ENA, positive 55 millivolts. And during the repolarization phase, voltage-gated potassium channels open, while the voltage-gated sodium channels are inactivated. When this happens, pK, which is the permeability of potassium, pK increases. When this happens, pK increases. Pna drops to 0, and as a result, the VM shifts toward the equilibrium potential for potassium, negative 80 millivolts. In the moments following the beginning of an action potential, there is a time window when a second action potential cannot be fired. This time window, about half a millisecond in duration, is called the absolute refractory period. On a molecular level, the absolute refractory period exists because the voltage-gated sodium channels are inactivated, which prevents them from being able to pass any more inward excitatory current. The absolute refractory period may last for up to a millisecond. A few milliseconds after the end of the absolute refractory period begins, a phase called the relative refractory period . Okay, it's not just me. It literally says this in the book. A few milliseconds after the end of the absolute refractory period begins, a phase called the relative refractory period probably means begins. During this phase, It's more difficult to fire an action potential compared to the resting condition. At the level of receptors, the relative refractory period exists for two main reasons. First, only some of the voltage-gated sodium channels have reset from the inactive state. Second, many of the voltage-gated potassium channels are still in the open state, which allows the movement of potassium ions, causing the neurons to rest at a more negative potential. Also, increased movement of potassium ions hinders depolarization, as the GHK equation demonstrates. Since potassium movement pulls membrane potential closer toward the equilibrium potential for potassium. This relative refractory period lasts as long as the after hyperpolarization and therefore exists on a gradient. The sooner after the repolarization phase of the first action potential, the more difficult it will be to reach the threshold for a second action potential. So that kind of goes over it. It's a lot, and I feel like I understand why they're not having me read that chapter just yet, for the sake of Neuroscience 101. But it is valuable. It does make sense. It was nice to kind of have an understanding of how that works. I am going to read 4.5. Again, if you're still following along with me from Neuroscience 101, we're in deep water over here. Like, this isn't, it's a little extra. But here we go. 4.5, movement of the action potential. Up to this point, we have only considered a single piece of cell membrane and how it responds during an action potential. For an action potential to travel from the axon hillock to the axon terminal, this temporary change in VM must physically move down the length of the axon. The ability for the action potential to travel is made possible because of the sodium ions that enter through the voltage-gated sodium channels that are not restricted to the cytoplasmic volume beneath the ion channels. These sodium ions behave just like any other substances that are in an area of high concentration. They move toward areas of low concentration. As sodium rushes into the cell, they follow the chemical gradient and quickly move toward areas of low concentration, which is the next section of membrane. When they do so, the next patch of the membrane becomes depolarized. This depolarization causes the next set of channels to open, which results in even more sodium influx. From here, the process repeats down the axon. The axon potential is a chain reaction that starts at the axon hillock and doesn't stop until the axon terminal. An action potential is like a wave. It only moves in one direction, and there are two main reasons why. First, sodium ions move down their concentration gradient. The sodium ions that enter through the voltage-gated sodium channels are less likely to want to move in the reverse direction, since the area currently has a relatively high sodium concentration. Instead, they will want to move toward the area with a low concentration of ions, which is the forward direction. Secondly, the previous patch of membrane is in the absolute refractory period, which makes it impossible for an action potential to travel backwards. During this time, many voltage-gated sodium channels are still inactivated, and most voltage-gated potassium channels are open. At the role of myelin. Previously, in discussing the cellular anatomy of neurons, we described myelin as the layers of lipid that are sometimes thickly wrapped around the axon of the neuron. Myelin increases conduction velocity, which is the speed at which an action potential travels down the length of an axon. Myelin works by physically blocking leak potassium channels in the cell membrane. By covering these channels, positive charges become unable to exit the cell, which causes the signal to move more rapidly. A myelinated axon still requires some influx of sodium ions for the signal to travel, however. This influx occurs at the nodes of Ranvier. I think it was Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier. The unmyelinated segments of the axon These areas are very dense with voltage-gated sodium channels. Because the channels in electrical charge are detected at intervals, we sometimes say that the signal is passed by saltatory conduction. Saltare is the Italian word for jump. In this chapter, we described the molecular and cellular underpinnings of the action potential, the main method of signaling that the nervous system uses for communication. In the following chapter, we will explain how neurons talk to one another using those electrical signals in combination with chemical signals called neurotransmitters. And this, my friend, concludes chapter 4. Thanks for sticking with me. I hope that this is helpful for those of you that are following along. I have no intention of editing this down to be more fluid because I really don't have the time. Again, I'm not getting paid for this, so I can't dedicate a whole lot of my time to it. Enjoy. Also, make sure to download this book. If you're interested in all things neuroscience, this is a fantastic tool. And if you're interested in contributing to tools like this being free, again, in the introduction pages of this book, you'll find the Bitcoin address where you can contribute to this cause. I'll see you for the next chapters.